Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show most likely to call for bail money. I'm Christy Powell. My co-host tonight is here to remind you that you can recover from religion. Welcome, Nate Smith.
Hi, Christy. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, glad to have you. And our guest tonight is a sex worker advocate. Welcome, Jack Parker.
Hey, thanks for having me on to talk about decrim.
Tonight, we're going to be hashing out the ins and outs of the professional in and out game. So give us a call, 512-991-9242. Or if you're living in the 21st century and you want to use the interwebs, it's tiny.cc/call-sex. So give us a call and let's talk.
All right. You know, we have poked around the edges of this conversation about sex work legalization versus decriminalization for as long as the show has been here. But in particular, I'm excited to really work out the details of a back and forth that Jack started with us last summer. Let me first say just thank you for raising these points and for offering us your point of view. Can we start by having you highlight why this is such an important debate to be having?
Yeah, for sure. I think for most spaces, they won't even talk about sex work. In most spaces I see online, they just won't have the discussion either because it's considered inherently not safe for work, or because it's too taboo, or they're too awkward and don't know enough. And I think even in spaces where we are having this conversation, it often tends to be that you talk to one or two sex workers, get a perspective, and then that is considered the perspective, which is why it's so important that we make sure it's an ongoing discussion with people with different opinions.
Yeah. Well, so then broadly speaking, what is the case for widespread decriminalization of sex work?
Among most sex workers I know, at least in organizations, we're fighting for decrim specifically because legalization, which has a wide variety of models, causes harm in various ways through proximity to police and through what those legal models do and what they require, like registries of sex workers, like rules about brothels and who can work where, because of the fact that most people who are doing sex work are doing it out of immediate desperation and immediate need for money. Decriminalization tends to suit their needs best for those reasons, because there isn't time to, jump through legal hoops when you have to feed your kids or you're going to be homeless if you don't sell sex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've already hit on decriminalization, the removal of any laws against versus legalization, the maybe moderation or government management of sex work. What are some other misunderstood or often misused terms that we're going to need to have this conversation?
I think probably the primary one that comes to mind is the term sex trafficking, because it is among people who are arguing either for legalization or for criminalization. You'll hear people talking about how sex trafficking is a main concern, and we need to look at whether the numbers of sex trafficking victims goes up or down in any legal model. And that often gets treated as the most important statistic in this, because when you think about it, you're like, okay, even if people who are doing consensual sex work are harmed, ultimately, if that means less sex trafficking victims, then we'll make a trade, right? That's how a lot of people think about it. Whereas the fact is, sex trafficking is often defined depending on where you live, including tons of consensual sex workers. So know that in the UK, if you sell sex under the age of 18, you're automatically considered a sex trafficking victim, even if no one else is involved. If you move to sell sex, you are considered a sex trafficking victim by definition here. So say you move from Hungary to the UK, just of your own volition because you think it would be better to live there. And then as soon as you move to the UK, you start selling sex because you sold sex where you came from and that's how you make money. If you start doing that and the government knows about it, you're considered a sex trafficking victim. And also if anyone else has control over your finances at any point or is taking a cut from sex work, that also will be considered sex trafficking. So you hear, oh, well, sex trafficking went up when this law was changed. You need to look into what definition they're using, because if by that they mean more people here are selling sex who are coming from abroad, okay, why is that necessarily bad? Or is it just that they're being noted now because people who came from abroad and were selling sex just weren't telling anyone that they were sex workers and therefore not being counted? Like, that is probably the most important term I can think of.
Yeah, no, that feels really important, and it leads us to perhaps the most important part of this conversation, which is how would decriminalization serve to protect sex workers?
Yeah, I think in terms of our safety, I think something that people often aren't considering is that the group that often makes sex workers the most unsafe is the police, or at least they contribute to other parts of our lack of safety. So police often harm sex workers. They engage in brothel raids. In the US, it is a worse situation than in the UK, where it's illegal to sell sex full stop. So they'll have sting operations where officers will have sex with sex workers, will pay them for that sex, and then will immediately arrest them and take the money from them, which, since their consent in that circumstance is conditional, they're saying, I will only have sex if I'm being paid for it. And because they're being arrested and their money's confiscated, they're not getting that money. That's a consent violation being done legally by the police.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of like brothel raids in the UK, people are stripped down, all of their money is taken, they're held for prolonged periods of time, even when it's not illegal for them to be working there, because the brothel itself is considered illegal. Those things don't happen if you have full decriminalization. There is no proximity to police. And if you have rules about who is allowed to do sex work when, like, okay, sex work is now legal, but only if you're getting regularly STD tested, which you have to register that you're doing with the government and therefore be on a registry. Someone's homeless, they sell sex the next week because they need to feed their kids. They don't have time to go and get tested first before they start or to register anywhere. They just go and do it. And suddenly that person's breaking the law. Now they have proximity to police, which is dangerous. And then on top of that proximity to the police, they now have maybe a criminal record, which stops them getting a job. Now they're stuck in sex work for longer, therefore they're in more danger.
Yeah, so these things all serve to seemingly marginalize even further folks that are, generally speaking, at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder and that are generally struggling. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. Marginalized people tend to flock towards sex work mostly because of the fact that there isn't quite the like boundary to entry. Like there's not a barrier to access in the same way a lot of jobs have them. A lot of jobs require that you have a card to get to it, or that you have some kind of qualification. You don't need any of that for sex work. You need the ability to post an advert online, basically, these days, or the ability to walk outside and sell sex on your street corner.
Yeah, well, then how would decriminalization impact clients of sex workers?
So in terms of what we've seen in places where either models close to decriminalization, or in the case of New Zealand, where they actually have decriminalization, we see that clients have less leverage to cause harm to sex workers, in the sense that they can't pressure for things in the same way because they aren't concerned about police getting involved with those sex workers. So it changes their behavior to harm us less, which is obviously important. But also it means that because clients can't be arrested for being clients, and it is fully decriminalized, they're not liable for anything that happens to us either. So they're not liable if they think something nefarious is going on to a sex worker and don't report it, which does happen when you have legalization. They're often liable for these things. Is that in that case, specifically, it isn't the situation that most clients are in any danger of arrest. It's the case that when people are arrested for being clients, it's usually done along racist lines. In fact, in plenty of places, you find that like much more than half of the people getting arrested for being clients of sex workers are non-white, even in places where the demographics are majority white people, because it's just another racist way to stop people. And you don't have to prove anything with sex work either, especially because of the proximity to sex and the taboo around it. You don't generally have to prove someone was buying sex. You don't have to have footage of that. The word of an officer is enough, meaning that anyone who is non-white can now be targeted with this the same way they can be targeted with loitering laws.
So is it fair then to say that, like, broadly speaking, the decriminalization movement is primarily meant to just remove police enforcement and get unnecessary voices, unnecessary violence out of this establishment?
Definitely. I know that when we talk about sex work, often we're talking about the danger coming from clients. And that's not to say there isn't a lot of danger from clients. There absolutely is. But across the board, from most sex workers I speak to, and it is my own experience, the group that we fear the most is the police.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are the faults then, as you see it, of the legalization movement, or this idea that we can come in with licensure and with a little bit of oversight in order to prevent some of that client violence?
I think mostly the problem with the legalization movement is that there is a misunderstanding of how the law even functions and how it changes human behavior. Making something legal or criminal doesn't really change what people do so much. It just changes how we react after the fact. So with legalization versus decriminalization, you put in barriers in place because you think, okay, well, we want more people to get STD tested, especially when they're involved in sex work, which is high risk. So what we'll do is we'll require people to get STD tested. And it's like, okay, but it doesn't actually change anyone's behavior in terms of whether they're doing risky behavior or not. So you haven't changed whether or not someone's likely to get an STD. What you have done is made it so that for them to legally do sex work, they have to register with the government, something we're all disinclined to do because the government has harmed us in many ways. And now you are punishing anyone who doesn't do that. So you haven't changed anything about who gets STDs at all. All you've done is criminalize a group of people who are further marginalized. And that applies to basically everything I've ever heard in terms of a regulation for sex work. I haven't really heard any convincing regulation singularly that would have a positive effect if policed in that way. Because the fact is, you can say we would prefer that people were doing this thing. We would prefer people are getting STD tested more, but you don't need the law to do that. You can have STD clinics become more accessible. In the case of the US, make sure there are more free places someone can get tested, have charities doing it, have outreach. But they don't do this. Instead, they're talking about changing what the laws are, which doesn't change behavior. It just punishes people. That's kind of what the law functions as in this circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I want to remind folks that we are taking calls and that we'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. We're here again at 512-991-9242. But I got to say, Jack, the way that you are laying it out makes it feel like this isn't much of a debate. Like it feels pretty straightforward that decriminalization makes a lot more sense. So I'm curious then, what some of the critiques of the decriminalization movement actually look like. What are the critics saying here?
Yeah, so I think some of it comes from like what I was saying earlier about sex trafficking, misunderstandings of whether or not decriminalization could increase sex trafficking or not. But I think to get to the core premise that causes most people who are like strong advocates against decrim specifically, not people who are misguided or who don't know about decrim versus legalization, but people who advocate for legalization over decrim, is this kind of belief that it would increase it would further normalize the sex industry and would increase the number of people in it. And because there is a lot of abuse in the sex industry, which is something that we have to acknowledge, they think about this logistically, which is that if there are more people in the sex industry and there's a certain percentage of people in the sex industry who are being horrifically abused, then the total number of people being abused goes up. And basically how they see it is, I would rather further subjugate this small group of people than increase the size and therefore increase the total number of people being harmed. I don't buy into that rhetoric because I don't think that that's how it works, right? If you scale something up, that doesn't mean all the percentages are going to stay the same and you're going to have the same number of people being abused. This idea that we need to stop sex work being normalized also strikes me as really Puritan, but that's probably the main critique I hear, is that it will further normalize and increase the size of the sex industry.
Yeah, so overall then, I mean, Nate, I don't know if you're hearing what I'm hearing, but it feels like this is all something of a smokescreen, just a excuse to maybe increase police involvement and come up with really more excuses to stigmatize sex work in general.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is just related to purity culture and the control that religion has over our society. And the quicker we can get rid of that, the better, right? Like, and as with anything, when you legalize and destigmatize anything, really, you help to eliminate the potential for a black market, which is what these people claim to fear. So if they truly are afraid of sex trafficking, I would think that getting it out in the open where it can be normal and examined would be what they want, but that's not the case. So that's what tells me that their concerns aren't really legitimate.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, Jack, how do you respond to folks who say that they fear for the safety of sex workers under decriminalization? You know, if they don't have the police to protect them, if they don't have a organization or a licensure board to report to, or things like that, it seems like a valid question. I'm curious how you respond to it.
Mostly I respond by just informing them of how worker protections work, because they're probably misguided about it. Something doesn't need to be legalized in this way for you to have protections. So if we were to decriminalize sex work, it would work under a similar model to, for example, babysitting, right? You don't have to have qualifications to babysit. You don't have to sign up to a board. The government doesn't approve you. You don't have a list of things you have to do. Someone can hire you as a babysitter to look after their kid, and they can just do that. People do that with their family members all the time, with friends, sometimes for payment, sometimes not. And that's kind of how you kind of move into it, is that babysitting isn't treated in this way where you have it as like it's not treated as a career in the same sense, sure, but you wouldn't have someone arrested for not following like certain procedures. The rules are just the same as they are for anyone taking care of a child, which is that you have to adequately take care of that kid. And with sex work, I mean, you have to adequately like make sure that you are respecting consent and, you know, having sex in a way that you want to do as two consenting adults. That's literally it.
Oh, looks like we may have lost Jack for a moment. We'll work on getting that straightened out. I'll remind folks again that we would love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your questions for Jack and just how you react to all of this. Nate, how are you feeling about all this conversation?
I like a lot of what Jack's saying. I'd also like to point out that in the United States, the police get a portion of money that they seize from the proceeds of crime. So, you know, these vice cops that are allowed to go and have sex with a prostitute, pay them, arrest them, keep the money, like how broken is that? Like, that makes absolutely no sense. And the other plus to decriminalization is that once we make it a bit more normal and we remove that stigma, it also eliminates another big problem that I happen to know that sex workers have, which is access to financial services, right? Like working in a cash only, or, you know, using online payment methods like PayPal or whatnot. You know, it's hard for someone, especially these marginalized parts of society, single moms or immigrants. It's hard for them to get credit. It's hard for them to get bank accounts. It's hard for them to have access to financial services. So that's yet another barrier that criminalization puts for these marginalized groups, and it's just making it worse for them. So if we truly want to help these people and fix it, you know, legalization, decriminalization is such a big part of that. Jack's back. What do you think? Did you catch what I said, Jack? Okay, I was just saying, I pointed out that police get to keep parts of the proceeds of crime that they seize, and also that decriminalization helps with another major barrier for sex workers, which is access to financial services. I'm wondering what's been your experience with that? Have you had troubles, and what can you tell us about that?
Are we going to meet with like someone who said they're a couple? Because when people are booking as couples, they're more likely to be police officers. They often come in twos. So a couple tries to book you and now you don't take them. You only take singular people because you're too scared of that risk. It also increases the need for things like CCTV. So you're often relying on third parties to be able to protect yourself from the cops. And those third parties are people who are taking a cut of your money and often treating you poorly, but you've got a trade-off. Like in most brothels that I'm aware of in the UK, there's a CCTV setup, which would be very expensive for someone to sort out themselves if they wanted to work from a flat with friends, which would be illegal, and it would make them owners of that brothel, which can get you years in prison. But working in a brothel isn't technically illegal. It's just if you work in one, it's fine, but if you help manage it, suddenly that becomes illegal. So it's like, okay, well, we'll let these people do the criminal stuff where they set up the brothel and we'll work in it, which isn't illegal. But now to do that, they're taking 50% of our money, often get control over what clients we see and what ones we don't, and have control over our access to funds and our access to work.
Well, it's worth pointing out then that even legal sex workers here in the state face incredible amounts of banking discrimination. It's something we talked about with Amberly Rothfield, and it occurs to me that even as we have this like awkward sort of stutter step situation with decriminalizing or perhaps legalizing marijuana, that there is still a incredible barrier and a lot of inequity in terms of banking. Is there any reason to believe that this would actually get better for if we decriminalize sex work?
It is, particularly because if you were to decriminalize, at least in the US, across the board, this wasn't like state by state, which is kind of how legalization would work. Is that it would work similar to how they've done things with marijuana, that state by state you do this. Now you have a banking problem, even if every single state makes it legal. You still have a problem because at the federal level you have issues. If you decriminalize at the federal level, you just don't have any laws on the books regarding prostitution specifically. Now there isn't an ability for banks to discriminate against you in this way, citing that. And also you can make sex work as a protected group, which I think is something people don't broadly consider. When we talk about queer people, and specifically like gay people getting certain protections legally, trans people getting certain protections legally, you know, we have conversations about this, and people don't consider that how this can be applied to other groups. For sex workers who are made up of a lot of people from these marginalized communities, it would be great if a bank specifically not only couldn't cite a law as to why they're not taking you, but if we were protected as a group. And they can't say it's because you're a sex worker even. Like that would be something that we could only get if it was decriminalized across the board and you had the government considering making sex workers a protected group.
Yeah, is there any reason at all to believe that decriminalization on a federal level is even on the agenda, is even on anybody's radar at this stage?
Yeah, I don't think it's something that would happen anytime soon. I can't imagine it being something that is going to happen like that. But something that we can do is work to decriminalize it in certain areas, really push to get certain states, especially ones who are closer to doing it, to do so. And then the question starts to open up on a federal level. Because if you have certain states do something, as this usually happens with basically any civil rights movement for any group, when you're pushing for a legal change like this, doing it in individual places and being able to point to those places and cite them as places where it worked means that you can get the conversation like to a much larger scale. Before New Zealand decriminalized sex work, we didn't have somewhere to point to in this way where we could show that the stats are great. But now we do, and the World Health Organization agrees that we should decriminalize sex work because they can show from what happened in New Zealand that even just the act of decriminalizing, even if we change nothing else, lowers STD rates among sex workers. We can prove that now, and we couldn't before it happened. And the same thing will apply in the US. If they do it in one state and can show how much it improves things, now you've got a case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I hear you saying that these laws are really something of a smokescreen, that they are really designed to just be used as a club to enforce some kind of ridiculous moral principles and to lean into or enforce purity culture, as well as perhaps generating money for the police and things along those lines. But it still begs the question why the idea of decriminalization isn't more of the norm, at least within perhaps the more progressive or the left wing of the general public. Why do you believe that this isn't a more common talking point or an idea that is, you know, routinely being presented to the voting public, or at least in Congress or wherever else?
Yeah, I think part of it is the lack of sex workers in a lot of these groups, because people aren't talking to sex workers, they're talking about us most of the time.
Sure.
So they're talking about it on the basis of thinking somewhat infantilizing, or in like a paternalistic way. They imagine protecting this group which is harmed, and they imagine doing that in the way that a lot of people imagine doing these things, by using the law to do so, or by using groups like police to do so, without actually having conversations with sex workers and realizing that those are the people harming us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's pretty brilliant, right? Is what you just said, is assuming that these people need to be saved or want to be saved. Like a lot of these people, from what I'm reading, brushing up on this topic this week, is that a lot of these people just didn't want to work shitty minimum wage jobs, so they went into sex work because they can make a decent buck at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think something that people aren't considering when they talk about this like savior complex that they have over sex workers is that there are a number of sex workers who do feel the need to be saved, but it's not from sex work, it's from poverty, which is the thing we need to be tackling, that's driving people into sex work who don't want to be there. The people who don't want to be in sex work, who are overwhelmingly, are people who are incredibly poor and don't have other options. So resolving their poverty is better. If you pull them out of sex work but give them no way to earn money, okay, now they're starving instead of having sex for money. How is that better?
It's fair to say.
Yeah.
One, and that's a question I'm really curious about. Nate, I didn't mean to step on you, though. Go right ahead.
No, I was just going to point out that, there's a lot of people that don't like their jobs. Like, I don't particularly like my job. I literally do the same thing. I sell my body for labor. I'm a tradesperson. I'm constantly covered in tiny little wounds, and it kind of stinks. But, not liking your job and, not wanting a job at all, right? Like, having a job is preferable to no job. So, we're all, it doesn't matter what we do for a living. We're all selling the fruits of our labor for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a question that's really challenging for me. This idea that most, if not the vast majority of sex workers are struggling financially. As a therapist, I work with a lot of sex workers, and I have to recognize, of course, that this is a self-selected group of people with a income and a level of privilege where they're able to reach out to a therapist and, have these types of services. So it makes me really curious what the typical, if I can use that word, sex worker really looks like from like a demographic standpoint. What sort of statistics or other information can you provide us to paint a picture of the people that we're largely talking about here?
Yeah, I think getting demographic information on sex work is obviously difficult,
Sure.
which is why I recommend going to groups like the ECP, the English Collective of Prostitutes, or Swarm to find out more information. But generally speaking, sex workers are overwhelmingly women, and the remaining portion tend not to be specifically cis men, but tend to be trans men and non-binary people. So we're talking about a profession which is only a small percentage of the people involved are men. We're also talking about a profession in which people who are multiply marginalized are more likely to get into sex work because they're more likely to be in poverty, which is a driving force for a lot of people. So you'll end up seeing a lot more people of color involved in sex work. You'll end up seeing a lot more queer people. You're a lot more likely to be involved in sex work if you are gay or bi or trans, obviously. And these kinds of things kind of all mesh together. But in terms of like the economic situation of people involved in sex work, we're usually talking about people who are in significant poverty, because that's the driving reason that most people join. When you look into polling on why people started sex work, it's usually because of poverty. That's cited as like their main reason. And we can see that especially from the demographics in both the US and in the UK during COVID, which is a time when you would think that the people working in person with sex work would go down, because people who are doing it in person are going to at least lower the number of clients they're seeing. But
Sure.
what we're actually seeing is the opposite, is that more people are doing sex work, vastly more. We're talking about in the UK, like the situation is so bad, especially with the benefit system coinciding and just kind of crashing, people not being covered, is that, I mean, stuff I've seen suggests that it's increased by a third, like the population of people selling sex. which tells me, especially when we see that directly linked to the benefit system crashing, like one affecting the other, and people citing that as their reason for starting. If it goes up that much and it's almost entirely poor people doing it during a situation like this, it tells us a lot about the existing demographic. But obviously it's hard to get these people and engage them. Basically everyone who's selling sex on the street, so who's standing on corners and is, you know, talking to people in cars passing by and soliciting that way, almost everyone in that situation is in extreme poverty, and a lot of them are active drug users. In terms of indoor sex workers, you start to have people who are in slightly better situations and circumstances. Usually they're not actively homeless, but they are in precarious housing, so they're on the edge of possibly being homeless. And like as you kind of go up the levels, I guess, in terms of like indoor, and you have security and you are fully independent and in charge of yourself, or work with an agency that only takes a small fee, now you're starting to get people who are in better and better financial situations. But generally speaking, most people are in pretty significant poverty.
How do you respond then, I suppose, to the just the picture of all of that? If we are looking to, you know, sell this idea to the voting public, I guess I struggle a little bit with how you package this notion of people who are in abject poverty, who don't have a whole lot of options, then being forced, if I can use air quotes and be a little casual with that term, to then sell sexuality. It almost sort of plays into like a purity culture talking point. How do you react to that?
I mean, what I would say to them is that we need to abolish poverty, not prostitution. It's the case that the people who are in this situation, who are the majority, but are not all, right? There are still plenty of people who are choosing sex work just because they prefer it to whatever job they were doing previously, or because they like sex. But the majority of people are in situations where they're doing it because they really need the money. The same as McDonald's workers are often doing it because they really need the money. People don't tend to be thrilled about working in McDonald's. And if you ask the average McDonald's employee, I bring up this specific example because someone did this with a statistic that a lot of Nordic model advocates bring up, which is that over 90% of people involved in the sex industry want to exit. And they bring this up by saying, well, over 90% of them don't want to be selling sex, so we need to help them out of the industry. And then someone did the same study with McDonald's workers, and it was a higher percentage of people who wanted to exit, who didn't want to be in the job. We have this problem with tons of jobs across society, but it's only when it's sex that we're not supposed to talk about the fact we don't like doing it. You'll see most sex workers, especially when they're speaking attached to their sex work name, talking about how much they love it, right? If I were here under the name I sell sex under, I would damn well be talking about how much I love it and how all of my clients are great and I enjoy selling sex, because of course I will, because it's free advertising for me. It brings me more clients, and the more decent clients I get, who are not the worst of them, who are the kind of people who'll be pulled in by, you know, like things like this, if I were to speak, right? Who are seeing me as like a person and coming to meet me from there are going to be the less shitty ones. So like, sure, we'll advertise ourselves, but when I get to speak as myself, no, I don't enjoy it. And the same way that a McDonald's employee will smile at customers and talk about how much they love working at McDonald's, but they don't in reality. I think that's the case for a lot of people in a lot of jobs. I don't tend to worry these days about playing into people who are, you know, talking about the sex industry is this terrible thing that fully needs to be abolished. Because I talk about how bad the sex industry can be, because yeah, it can be bad, and it's bullshit to claim that that's why we should get rid of it. We need to abolish poverty, not prostitution. If it's a choice between me starving or me sucking dick to pay rent, I'm going to sell sex because that's better than starving. It just is. If they don't want me to have to make that choice, how about they make it so that people don't starve?
No, I think that that's a really brilliant point. I do want to circle back to something you said, though, and as we're talking about decriminalization versus legalization, I think it probably is important to go ahead and walk the audience through the Nordic model, that thing that you referenced a moment ago. Can you explain what that looks like to us?
Yeah, so the Nordic model is a specific model which could be referred to as a type of legalization. I would probably also call it partial criminalization. And the idea of the Nordic model is that it is decriminalized to sell sex, but it is completely illegal to pay for sex, and it is also illegal to run a brothel. It's illegal to get proceeds from prostitution, it's illegal to hire security because they'll be making money from your prostitution. And in places where this is implemented, it tends to work very negatively for sex workers. It affects who you can be with, because any partner of yours who you share funds with is now guilty of like making money off of your prostitution, and your money as proceeds from it can be confiscated anytime. You can't work together with other people in a brothel environment. And because it's illegal to pay for sex, clients are already criminalized, which incentivizes them to harm the sex workers they see. If they're worried about you reporting them to police, why not harm you to try and keep you quiet? Because they're already at risk. And in fact, they're honestly not going to face much worse charges if they physically assault you versus if they just pay for sex. So why not tack that on, is the mentality of a lot of the clients in these places.
What kind of numbers or things have you seen in the places that employ a model like that?
Yeah, in countries that apply the Nordic model, what we see is that the rates of sex trafficking, when we're talking about specifically sex trafficking being defined as people coerced into the sex industry or forced by third parties, stay almost entirely the same. It doesn't change a thing. It doesn't lessen the number of them it's happening to. What it does do is put consensual sex workers in a worse position. So when you look at places that have the Nordic model versus places that have various forms of legalization, in the UK, selling and buying sex is legal, for example. So if we compare here versus somewhere like Sweden, Sweden is in a situation where sex workers have a much higher level of fear of the police, and they report abuse much more often. And depending on the areas you're looking at about double the rate of assault. So if we're talking about sex workers having like a baseline rate, it's almost double there. And you can also see this happening when they implement the Nordic model, which is that you go and talk to sex workers before, have a sample size, go back afterwards and talk to them again, and you're going to see the same thing. Swarm and the English Collective of Prostitutes have really good graphics with all this specific information, but it's roughly doubling in terms of the assault level. And that's not including police. That is just from clients. Obviously, police are more involved when you are selling sex to a contingent of people who are, because they're buying sex from you, breaking the law. The police have to go to the source. They can't find clients by walking around to see who looks like a client. But if they stand outside of the door of someone who's selling sex, now they have a pretty good chance that people going in that room are clients. And that's how they find you. Proximity to police increases the assault too. But that isn't even a statistic we have.
Sure.
Yeah, the naivete of that entire approach cannot be overstated. Like, it's, you can sum it up in the very first phrase that explains it. They want to eliminate the demand for sex. Like, are you serious? We were fucking before we were farming. You're going to try to eliminate the buyers? Like, that is never, ever, ever going to happen. Not only has prohibition never worked anywhere we've ever tried it, but I mean, like Jack was saying earlier, that getting better clients is more important. So if you criminalize the buyer, all you're going to do is make it more likely for the good clients to not do it, right? And you're going to drive the seedier, more dangerous people to these workers, right? It's gonna be more dangerous. They're gonna have to hide out. They're gonna meet in more dangerous places. They're not gonna have the time to negotiate. They're not gonna want to talk about rates or anything like that. Like, it's so stupid on so many levels. When I was reading about it, I'm like, what legislature actually thought this would be a successful idea? It's so baffling to me.
Yeah, it's sort of presented as maybe a way of like maintaining the criminalization of sex work while being a little bit more feminist and sort of protecting female sex workers. Is there any validity to that in y'all's minds?
I mean, you see a lot of overlap between the kinds of people who argue that and like people who are also incredibly transphobic. And I think that kind of exposes a lot of where this comes from, is that you see a lot of TERFs and then the group that people call SWERFs, who are usually Nordic model advocates, and it's a similar acronym to TERF, right? Sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, who are a group of people claiming they're doing this to rescue sex workers. And you see the same funding too, which I guess it's important to bring up, especially on a show like this, often comes from these fundamentalist religious groups. So you'll see that a lot of TERFs are funded by these fundamentalist religious groups. And in the case of SWERFs, you'll see groups like Exodus Cry funding a lot of them, which is specifically a fundamentalist Christian group, which talks a lot about how they want to lessen sex trafficking and fully supports the Nordic model. And when you read through the stuff that they have as their information on their site, I mean, you can see pretty quickly where it's coming from, and that it's coming from a religious fundamentalist perspective, and purity culture is a large part of it.
Yeah, always check where the money is coming from. If I jump into one more like sex therapist advocacy type group or something along those lines and see people promoting fight the new drug, my head is going to absolutely explode.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to pull up the phones here in just a moment. Did y'all have anything you wanted to add before we move on for a moment?
The Nordic model is stupid and no one should ever even consider it or think about it again. That's all.
All right, cool. I like that we've got some hot takes.